kiss me now, in case he catches us, and it's the last for me!
Stephanie Okoye said the words with her lips inches from a stranger's mouth, her voice cracking under the weight of terror, hope, and the reckless prayer of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The Seoul Express bus terminal roared around them, announcements crackling overhead in rapid Korean, wheels of suitcases clattering against tile, 1,000 strangers moving in every direction under buzzing fluorescent light. It was not raining. The night was alive, loud, indifferent, the kind of busy that could swallow a person whole and never notice they were gone. She had been running for 6 minutes. It felt like 6 years. The man she'd thrown herself against stood over 6 feet tall, dressed in a black wool coat that fit him the way armor fits a soldier, not for beauty, but for war. His jaw was carved from something colder than patience. His eyes, dark and unreadable, dropped to the woman now gripping the lapels of his coat like she might fall through the floor if she let go. He hadn't moved. He hadn't pushed her away. He was studying her the way a predator studies weather before deciding if a storm is worth the trouble. "Please," Stephanie whispered, and this time her voice broke completely. "Please. I know you don't know me. I know this is insane. But if he sees my face right now, he will kill me. I need you to kiss me so he thinks I'm just a woman with her boyfriend. Please." For one unbearable second, nothing happened. Then his hand rose, slow, deliberate, and cupped the side of her face, his thumb brushing beneath her wet eye, wiping away a tear she hadn't known had fallen. And he kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not soft the way first kisses in movies were soft. It was fierce and certain, a kiss built to be believed, and for 3 full seconds Stephanie Okoye forgot that a monster named Kelechi Obi was somewhere behind her in that crowd, hunting. When the stranger finally pulled back, his eyes flicked over her shoulder, scanning the terminal with the practiced calm of a man who had done far worse than pretend to love someone to save her life. "He's gone," he said quietly, in accented but flawless English. "The man in the gray jacket." He turned toward gate 14. Stephanie's knees buckled. He caught her by the elbow before she hit the ground, steadying her against his chest as her breath came out in a ragged, disbelieving sob. "You saw him," she whispered. "You actually saw him." "I see everyone," the stranger said simply. "It is a bad habit." She looked up at him properly for the first time, really looked, and something in her chest tightened that had nothing to do with fear. He had the face of someone carved out of consequence, cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, a small white scar interrupting one eyebrow like punctuation on a sentence of violence. And yet his hand was still gentle on her arm, steady, patient, like he had all the time in the world to hold a stranger together. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping back, mortification flooding in behind the adrenaline. "I shouldn't have. I don't even know your name. I just saw you standing here and something in me I ran. I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize for surviving," he said. 3 words. They landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, and Stephanie felt something she hadn't felt in 8 months. Safe. She didn't know, in that moment, standing in the chaos of the Seoul Express bus terminal with her lipstick smudged from a kiss that had saved her life, that the man she had run to, a complete stranger, chosen by nothing but blind instinct and desperation, was the single most feared man in the entire city. She didn't know that the underworld called him the widower's blade. She didn't know that men twice her ex-boyfriend's size went pale and silent when his name was spoken. She only knew that for the first time in almost a year, her body had stopped shaking. His name was Ji-wook, though very few people alive still used it. "You're bleeding," he said suddenly, nodding at her wrist, where her sleeve had ridden up to reveal 4 crescent-shaped bruises pressed deep into the skin, dark purple against her brown skin, fresh enough that they were still tender to look at. Stephanie yanked her sleeve down instantly, shame flooding her face hot. "It's nothing. It's not nothing." His voice didn't rise, but something underneath it went very still, very cold, like ice forming over a lake. "Who did that to you?" "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." She stared at him, stunned by the strange, unearned intensity of a stranger's concern. "Why? You don't know me. 20 minutes ago you didn't know I existed. You put your trust in me when you had every reason to run in a different direction," Ji-wook said. "That is not nothing, either." Behind them, the terminal speaker system crackled with another boarding call, and somewhere in the crowd a child laughed, oblivious to the quiet catastrophe unfolding a few feet away. Stephanie became aware, all at once, of how exposed they still were. How Kelechi could double back, how Gate 14 was not far enough, how 6 months of running from Lagos to London to Seoul had taught her that safety was never permanent, only borrowed. "I need to go," she said, panic creeping back into her voice. "If he comes back. Where are you staying?" "I don't. I was going to get on the next bus out. Anywhere. I don't care where." Ji-wook studied her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes, a decision being made, weighed, finalized. "Come with me. I don't even know you. You kissed me 2 minutes ago to stay alive," he said, the faintest, almost invisible curve tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think we're past the formalities." Despite everything, despite the fear still hammering in her ribs, despite 8 months of learning that trusting a man could get her killed, Stephanie laughed. It surprised her, the sound escaping like something that had been locked in a cage too long. "Fine," she said. "But if you turn out to be a serial killer, I want you to know I saw this coming." "I promise you," Ji-wook said, guiding her gently through the crowd with a hand at the small of her back, "I am something far worse than a serial killer. But I am not interested in hurting you." She didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. They stepped out of the terminal into the electric wash of Seoul at night. Neon signage bleeding red and blue across wet pavement from an earlier rain shower, taxis honking, street vendors calling out the last of their orders, the whole city thrumming like a living organism that never truly slept. A black sedan was waiting at the curb, engine idling, and the moment Ji-wook approached, the driver's door opened and a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit stepped out and bowed low, deep, immediate, reflexive. Stephanie froze. "Who bows like that to a person?" she asked quietly, suspicion sparking behind the exhaustion. "Loyal employees," Ji-wook said smoothly, opening the car door for her. "I own several businesses. People are respectful." It should have felt like a red flag. Later, she would replay this exact moment 100 times and wonder how she had missed it, how instinct, the same instinct that had thrown her into his arms, hadn't screamed louder. But exhaustion has a way of dimming alarm bells, and Stephanie Okoye had not slept more than 3 hours a night in 8 months. She got into the car. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, gliding into the river of Seoul traffic, Stephanie allowed herself, for one shaking breath, to look back at the terminal doors. No sign of Kelechi. No gray jacket cutting through the crowd. Just neon and noise and distance, finally, blessedly, growing between her and the man who had promised, the last time he split her lip, that she would never truly leave him. "You're safe," Ji-wook said from beside her, watching her rather than the road. "You don't know that," Stephanie whispered. "You don't know him." "No," Ji-wook agreed, his voice dropping into something quieter, something with an edge she couldn't quite name. "But I know men like him. And I know what happens to men like him when they make the mistake of becoming my problem." She didn't understand the weight behind that sentence. She wouldn't understand it for days. Inside the terminal they'd left behind, in the shadow of Gate 14, Kelechi Obi stood very still, phone pressed to his ear, his gray jacket blending into the crowd exactly as Ji-wook had said. His eyes, cold and calculating, tracked the black sedan pulling away through the terminal's glass doors before it vanished into traffic. "I found her," he said into the phone, his voice flat, controlled, terrifyingly calm. "She's not alone. Some man just picked her up. Expensive car. Private driver." A pause. "No, I don't know who he is yet. But I will." On the other end of the line, a voice, older, rougher, carrying the particular menace of a man used to being obeyed, asked a single question. "Does it matter who he is?" Kelechi's mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile. "No," he said. "It doesn't matter who he is. It only matters that he's in my way now. And I don't leave things in my way." He hung up, slid the phone into his pocket, and walked calmly out of the terminal into the busy Seoul night, disappearing into the same crowd that had, minutes earlier, hidden Stephanie's escape, never once suspecting that the stranger his ex-girlfriend had run to for a single desperate kiss was a man whose name, when whispered in the right rooms of this city, could empty a building in under a minute. The apartment Ji-wook brought her to occupied the entire top floor of a building overlooking the Han River, all glass and steel and quiet, expensive restraint, the kind of place that didn't announce wealth, it assumed it. Stephanie stood in the doorway for a long moment, arms wrapped around herself, taking in floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering city like a painting. "This is your house," she asked. One of them, he said, then seemed to catch himself, as if he'd revealed something he hadn't meant to. One of them, she repeated slowly. What exactly do you do, mister? I don't even know your last name. Han, he said. Han Ji-wook. And what I do is complicated. Tonight, what matters is that you eat something, you sleep somewhere with a locked door, and tomorrow we figure out what comes next. She wanted to argue. She wanted to demand answers, to interrogate every soft-spoken half-truth falling from his mouth. But her body betrayed her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the terminal was draining fast, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made the room tilt slightly. I haven't eaten today, she admitted quietly, the confession more humiliating than she expected. Something flickered across his face. Not pity, she would realize later, but fury, quiet and contained, aimed somewhere far away from her. Sit down, he said. I'll fix that. While he moved through the kitchen with the unhurried competence of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that taking care of things himself was safer than trusting others to do it right, Stephanie sank onto the edge of a leather couch and finally let herself cry. Not the panicked, gasping sobs of the terminal, but slower, heavier tears, the kind that came from months of holding herself together with nothing but stubbornness and fear. She thought of Lagos, of the small flat she'd shared with Kelechi and Lekki, of the man who had been so charming in the beginning that her sister had cried happy tears at their engagement announcement. She thought of the first time he'd grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise, and how she had believed him when he said it was because he loved her too much, was too afraid of losing her. She thought of the night 8 months ago when his hands had closed around her throat and something in her, some final surviving instinct, had understood with total clarity that if she stayed, she would die in that flat and no one would find her for days. She had run with nothing but a stolen passport, borrowed money from a cousin in London, and a fear so total it had followed her across 3 countries. And somehow Kelechi had followed too, through London, through a temporary refuge with a friend in Manchester, and now here, to Seoul, to a city she'd chosen at random specifically because she knew no one here and thought that might, finally, be enough. He's obsessed, she said aloud, not realizing Ji-wook had returned until she saw him standing near the kitchen island, a bowl of something warm in his hands, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Tell me about him, Ji-wook said, setting the bowl down in front of her, his voice deceptively gentle. Everything. His name. Because, Ji-wook said, sitting across from her, his dark eyes steady and unblinking, a man doesn't chase a woman across 3 countries without resources. Without money. Without help. I want to understand what kind of man is hunting you, Stephanie. She hadn't told him her name yet. She was almost certain of it. How do you know my name? For the first time since the terminal, something like hesitation crossed his face, a crack in the composure, quickly smoothed over. You said it. In the car. When you were talking about your sister. She didn't remember saying it. She was too tired to trust her own memory. She let it go. His name is Kelechi, she said instead, wrapping her hands around the warm bowl, letting the heat seep into fingers that had been cold with fear for hours. Kelechi Obi. He ran, an import business in Lagos. Electronics, mostly. But there were always other things moving through his warehouses. Things I wasn't supposed to ask about. Ji-wook's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, focused, like a man recalibrating a familiar map. Import business, he repeated softly. Lagos to Seoul is a long way for electronics. I don't know how he found me here, Stephanie whispered. I told no one where I was going. I used a different name to book my flight. I did everything right, and he still found me, and I don't understand how, and I am so tired of being afraid, I don't know how to stop being afraid. Her voice cracked and broke entirely, and this time when she cried, Ji-wook crossed the room and sat beside her, not touching her, simply present, a wall of quiet solidity beside her collapsing composure. You will stop being afraid, he said, because tomorrow I am going to find out exactly who is helping him, and I am going to make certain he understands, very clearly, that Seoul is not a city he is welcome in. Something about the certainty in his voice, the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who did not make promises he couldn't keep, should have terrified her. Instead, for the first time in 8 months, Stephanie Okoye slept a full 6 hours, curled beneath a stranger's blanket in a stranger's home, while the stranger himself sat awake in the next room, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, clipped Korean to men who called him something other than Han Ji-wook. Find out who this Kelechi Obi is working with, he said quietly into the phone. I want a name by morning. And find out how he tracked her from London. Someone sold that information. I want to know who. On the other end, a voice, cautious, deferential, asked the question every one of his men eventually asked, sooner or later, about every stranger who found their way into his orbit. Boss. Who is she to you? Ji-wook looked toward the closed bedroom door, toward the sound of a woman finally sleeping without nightmares, and answered with a certainty that surprised even himself. She's under my protection now, he said. That's all that matters. He did not yet know that somewhere across the city, in a dim room lit only by a laptop screen, Kelechi Obi was scrolling through photographs, surveillance photographs, purchased at considerable expense from a contact inside Incheon Airport security, studying the face of the man who had put his hands on Stephanie in the middle of a crowded bus terminal. He did not yet know that Kelechi had recognized something in that face, something from a business deal gone catastrophically wrong 3 years earlier in Busan, a deal that had cost Kelechi's associates 2 shipping containers and one man's life. He did not yet know that the name Han Ji-wook meant nothing to Kelechi Obi. But the name Cha Min-jun did. Morning came pale and gray over Seoul, sunlight filtering weakly through the high windows of the apartment while Stephanie woke disoriented in unfamiliar sheets, her heart hammering for one terrified second before memory caught up with her. The terminal, the kiss, the man with the steady hands and dangerous eyes. She found him in the kitchen, already dressed, already on the phone, his voice low and clipped in rapid Korean that shifted, the moment he noticed her, into something gentler, apologetic. I have to step out this morning, he said, ending the call. Business. You'll be safe here, the building has security, and I've arranged for someone to stay in the lobby. Business, she repeated, watching him carefully. There was something different about him this morning, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there the night before, a watchfulness in his eyes that reminded her, unwillingly, of the way Kelechi used to scan a room before entering it, cataloging exits, threats, weaknesses. Ji-wook, she said slowly, testing the name. Who are you, really? He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and for a moment she thought he might actually tell her the truth. Instead he offered a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Someone who is trying to keep you alive, he said. Is that not enough for now? It wasn't. But she let him go anyway, because the alternative was facing, alone, the growing certainty curling in her stomach that the man who had kissed her to save her life was not entirely who he claimed to be, and that she had, once again, placed her trust and her safety in the hands of a man with secrets. She didn't know that 3 floors below, in the underground garage, 2 black SUVs were waiting, engines running, 6 men in dark suits standing at attention as Cha Min-jun, the name Seoul's underworld actually knew him by, stepped out of the elevator with an expression that made grown men flinch. Kelechi Obi, he said, without preamble, to the man closest to him. Nigerian national. Import business out of Lagos, likely a front for something larger. I want everything. His contacts here, who's sheltering him, who sold him information about her location. And I want to know, his voice dropped, cold and final, exactly how he knows my real name. Because that was the detail that had kept him awake past 3 in the morning, long after Stephanie had finally fallen asleep, a single line buried in the intelligence his people had gathered overnight, a fragment of a phone call intercepted near the terminal. Kelechi Obi had not called him a stranger. He had not described him as the man she ran to. He had called him, quite specifically, by a name Cha Min-jun had buried 3 years and 2 countries ago, the name of the man responsible for the deaths of 2 of the Nightshade Syndicate's most senior lieutenants in a Busan warehouse that had gone up in flames. Somewhere, somehow, in a twist neither Stephanie nor Min-jun yet understood, the abusive ex-boyfriend she had run 3 countries to escape and the criminal empire that had made Min-jun the most feared man in Seoul were not strangers to each other at all. They were enemies. Old ones. And Stephanie Okoye, without knowing it, had run, by pure blind instinct, by nothing but desperate luck, directly into the arms of the one man in the entire city capable of destroying the empire hunting her. The only question left was which side of that war would reach her first. Stephanie spent the morning pacing the glass-walled apartment like a woman awaiting a verdict. Every sound from the hallway sent her heart into her throat, the elevator chime, a door closing somewhere down the corridor, even the soft hum of the refrigerator cycling on. By noon she had convinced herself she was losing her mind, imagining conspiracies in a stranger's silence, and by 1 o'clock she had convinced herself of something far worse, that she was. She found his laptop left open on the kitchen counter, screen dimmed but not locked. She told herself she wouldn't look. She looked anyway. The document on the screen was a list of names, half in Korean, half in English, annotated with numbers she didn't understand, shipment codes, maybe, or account figures. But one name stopped her breath entirely, printed in stark black letters near the top of the page. Kelechi Obi. Lagos, Busan Connection, 2023. Confirmed supplier chain. Her hands went cold. She scrolled, frantic now, not caring that she was trespassing on a stranger's private files, and found more, surveillance photos of shipping containers, a warehouse fire dated 3 years earlier, columns of numbers that could only be money, obscene amounts of it, moving between accounts she'd never heard of. "Oh my God," she whispered to the empty apartment. "Oh my God, what did I do?" The door opened behind her at that exact moment, and she spun around so fast she nearly knocked the laptop from the counter. Ji-wook stood in the doorway, still in the same dark coat from the night before, his expression shifting the instant he saw her face, from relief at finding her safe, to something colder, more guarded, as he registered what she was standing over. "You went through my things," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was worse, a simple, flat statement of fact, delivered without anger, which somehow made it more frightening than if he'd shouted. "You know him," Stephanie said, her voice shaking. "You know Kelechi. This isn't, you didn't just happen to be standing in that terminal, did you? None of this was chance." Ji-wook closed the door behind him slowly, deliberately, the click of the lock unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "I didn't know your name until you told me last night," he said. "I didn't know your face. I have never seen you before in my life, Stephanie, and that part, the part where you ran to me, where you chose me, that was chance. That I promise you. Then what's this?" She gestured wildly at the screen, at the name printed there in cold, damning letters. "Why is his name on your computer? Why are you? Who even are you?" He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Stephanie felt the floor of her fragile new safety crack wide open beneath her feet. "My name is not Han Ji-wook," he said finally. "It's Cha Min-jun. And the reason your ex-boyfriend's name is on my screen is because 3 years ago, his business associates in Busan killed 2 men who worked for me. I have been trying to find out who supplies them ever since. When I saw his face in that terminal, before you ever ran to me, I recognized him. I was already watching him. You didn't choose a stranger last night, Stephanie. You ran, by some accident of God I still don't understand, directly into the one man in Seoul already hunting the man hunting you." The room tilted. Stephanie reached for the counter to steady herself, her mind reeling backward through every warm, gentle moment of the last 12 hours, reassembling them now with this new, monstrous context. The bowed driver. The private security. The name that wasn't real. The certainty in his voice when he'd promised, last night, that Kelechi would learn Seoul was not a city he was welcome in. "You're not just some businessman," she said slowly, horror dawning cold and complete. "You're a criminal. You're exactly like him." "No," Min-jun said, and for the first time real emotion cracked through his composure, something sharp, almost wounded. "I am nothing like him. I have never once, in my life, raised my hand against a woman. I have never terrorized someone who trusted me. Yes, I run an organization other men fear. Yes, my hands are not clean. But I am not hunting you, Stephanie. I am hunting the man who hunts you. There is a difference, even if you cannot see it right now. How am I supposed to trust anything you say?" "You don't have to trust me," he said quietly. "You only have to survive the next few days. And I am, whether you like it or not, the safest option you have left." She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to run, to find another terminal, another train, another country to disappear into, the way she had run 4 times already in 8 months. But some exhausted, clear-eyed part of her, the part that had survived Kelechi's hands around her throat, that had crossed 3 countries alone with nothing but fear and stubbornness, recognized the terrible truth in what he'd said. She had nowhere else to go. And whoever this man really was, he had not hurt her. Not once. Not even when he'd had every opportunity. "Tell me everything," she said instead, her voice low, trembling but resolute. "If I'm going to stay in this apartment with a man who lied about his name, I want the truth. All of it. What is Kelechi really involved in? Why is he chasing me across the world instead of just letting me go?" Min-jun crossed the room slowly and sat across from her, and for the first time since the terminal, He looked less like a predator and more like a man carrying a weight he hadn't wanted to set down in front of her. Kelechi Obi's import business is a front, he said. Electronics on paper. In reality, his warehouses move something far more valuable. Trafficked girls, mostly from West Africa, moved through Lagos to Busan, then distributed through networks across East Asia. 3 years ago, 2 of my men infiltrated that supply chain to shut it down. They were discovered. They were killed. Slowly, from what I understand, as a message. His jaw tightened. I have spent 3 years trying to find the man responsible. Last night, in a bus terminal, I found him standing 20 feet away from me, and the woman he was hunting ran into my arms and asked me to kiss her to save her life. Stephanie's stomach turned violently. Trafficking, she whispered. He wanted to sell me. I don't think so, Min-jun said carefully. I think, from what little I understand of men like him, that his obsession with you is personal, not business. But I also think a man capable of building that business is not a man who lets go of anything, or anyone, easily. Whatever his reasons for chasing you, Stephanie, they will not stop being dangerous just because we don't fully understand them. She sat in silence, absorbing the full, sickening scope of what she'd escaped, and what, apparently, she had run straight into instead. A trafficker on one side, a crime lord on the other, and somewhere in the middle, herself, a woman who had only ever wanted to survive one relationship and had instead stumbled into a war between empires. I want out, she said finally, her voice raw. Not out of your apartment. Out of this. All of it. I never asked to be anyone's business, or anyone's message, or anyone's revenge. I just wanted to not be afraid anymore. Min-jun reached across the space between them, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and closed his hand gently over hers. Then let me finish this, he said. Let me end what he started. Not for revenge. For you. So you never have to run again. Before she could answer, his phone buzzed violently against the counter, and the expression that crossed his face as he read the message drained every trace of warmth from the room in an instant. What? Stephanie whispered. What is it? He knows, Min-jun said quietly, standing, already reaching for his coat. Kelechi knows who I am. He knows my real name. And he's just sent a message to every contact I have in this city. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something that might have been fear flicker behind his composed exterior. He says if I don't hand you over by midnight, he's going to burn my organization to the ground, starting with the people I love most. Outside, the gray afternoon had begun bleeding into early evening, and somewhere across the sprawling, glittering chaos of Seoul, Kelechi Obi sat in a rented room with a phone in one hand and a photograph of Stephanie in the other, smiling the particular smile of a man who believed, with total and terrifying conviction, that he had finally found the one thing capable of bringing the great Cha Min-jun to his knees. He had no idea he had just declared war on the wrong man. Min-jun's apartment transformed within the hour into something Stephanie hadn't expected. Not a fortress of panic, but a war room of quiet, controlled fury. Men in dark suits moved through the space with clipped efficiency, speaking in low Korean, laptops open on every surface, a large monitor on the far wall slowly filling with photographs, maps, timelines. Stephanie sat curled on the edge of the couch, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the machinery of a criminal empire mobilize around her like she was the epicenter of an earthquake she hadn't asked to cause. I don't understand how any of this is happening, she said quietly, to no one in particular, when Min-jun finally sat beside her, exhaustion carved into the lines of his face for the first time since she'd met him. Yesterday, I was just trying to buy a bus ticket. Yesterday, you were trying to survive, he corrected gently. There's a difference between what you were doing and what's happening around you now. None of this is your fault, Stephanie. I need you to understand that. Doesn't feel that way. Her voice cracked. Feels like everywhere I go, I bring destruction with me. First Kelechi destroyed my life in Lagos. Now I'm sitting in the middle of whatever this is, and you're telling me people you love are in danger because of me. Because of him, Min-jun said, firm and immediate. Not you. Never you. A man doesn't get to terrorize a woman for 8 months, chase her across 3 countries, and then blame her for the war he starts trying to reclaim her. That's his violence, Stephanie. Not yours to carry. She looked at him then, really looked, past the danger and the deception and the false name, and saw something achingly familiar in his eyes. Not pity. Understanding. You've seen this before, she said slowly. Haven't you? Someone you loved, who? My mother, he said, and the word came out rougher than he intended, the practiced composure slipping just slightly. My father was not a good man. I watched, 4 years, what it looked like when someone believed love meant ownership. I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had the power to stop that from happening to someone else, I would use it. Whatever else people say about the things I've done, that promise I have kept. Stephanie felt tears rise, hot and unexpected, and this time she didn't try to stop them. Why does that make me trust you more instead of less? You lied to me about your name. You're involved in things I can't even process. And still, somehow. Because I have never lied to you about the only thing that matters, Min-jun said quietly, his hand finding hers again, steady, warm, certain. I will not let him touch you. Whatever it costs. Across the room, one of his men, a broad-shouldered lieutenant named Sung-min, cleared his throat, hesitant to interrupt but clearly carrying news that couldn't wait. Boss. We found something. Min-jun rose instantly, the tenderness in his face hardening back into the calculated stillness Stephanie had first met in the terminal. These two, Sung-min said, pointing, are known associates of the Beck family. Rival syndicate, based out of Incheon. We've had tension with them for 2 years, nothing that's escalated to open conflict. But if Obi has aligned himself with them, then this isn't just a jilted man chasing his ex-girlfriend, Min-jun finished grimly. This is a business opportunity for the Becks. A chance to weaken me by using her as leverage, and simultaneously take out a trafficking rival who's been cutting into their supply routes. He exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. Obi didn't come to Seoul for her. He came here already planning to expand his operation. Finding her was convenience. Using her against me is strategy. Stephanie felt sick. So this whole time, I wasn't just running from a jealous ex. I was running from a business deal. You were running from a predator, Min-jun said, turning to face her fully. The fact that predators find ways to profit from cruelty doesn't make what he did to you any less personal, Stephanie. Don't let him steal that from you too, the truth of what he did, twisted into something smaller than it was. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the cheap burner phone she'd bought in London, the number known only to her sister back in Lagos. She almost didn't answer, hands shaking too badly, until she saw the caller ID and something in her chest seized with panic. Unknown number. She answered against every instinct screaming at her not to, and Kelechi's voice, smooth, calm, terrifyingly familiar, filled her ear like poison. Stephanie. Baby. Do you know how long I've been looking for you? The room around her seemed to tilt violently. Min-jun was instantly at her side, reading the horror on her face, gesturing sharply for Sung-min to start tracing the call. Don't call me that, Stephanie whispered, her voice shaking despite every effort to steady it. We're done, Kelechi. I'm done. We're not done until I say we're done, Kelechi said, his tone shifting, the pleasant mask sliding just slightly to reveal the venom underneath, the same venom she'd heard 100 times in that lecky flat, right before his hands found her throat. You embarrassed me, running like that. Do you know what people think of a man whose woman runs from him? I built you a life, Stephanie. I gave you everything. And you repay me by throwing yourself at some Korean gangster in a bus station like a common. Stop, she said, tears streaming freely now, but her voice, to her own surprise, did not break. You didn't build me a life. You built me a cage. And I would rather die running from you than spend one more day pretending your hands on my throat were love. There was a silence on the line, cold and dangerous. You'll regret that, Kelechi said quietly. And so will he. Tell your new friend I said hello. Tell him I know exactly who he really is now. And tell him, his voice dropped into something almost gentle, almost affectionate, which made it so much worse, that I always collect what's mine. One way or another. The line went dead. Stephanie stood frozen, phone still pressed to her ear, staring at nothing, until Min-jun gently pried it from her shaking hand and passed it to Sung-min, who was already running the trace. He's close, Sung-min said grimly, eyes on the screen. Signals pinging from somewhere within 2 kilometers of this building. Min-jun's expression went utterly, terrifyingly still. "He's not hunting her from a distance anymore," he said quietly. "He's here. He's already outside." The apartment fell into a different kind of motion, not panic, but the precise, disciplined choreography of men who had prepared for exactly this moment. Curtains drawn. Lights dimmed to half. 2 men posted at the door, 2 more descending to the lobby, Sungmin's fingers flying across a keyboard as he pulled up feeds from every camera in a 3-block radius. "There," he said, and the monitor filled with grainy footage of a gray jacket cutting across the street below, flanked by 2 other men Stephanie didn't recognize. Broader, harder-looking, the kind of men whose presence alone announced violence before they ever raised a hand. "Those are Beck men," Min-jun said, jaw tight. "He didn't come alone. He came with muscle." Stephanie stood rooted to the spot, watching the small gray figure on the screen, the man who had once been the center of her whole terrified world, reduced now to pixels on a monitor, and somehow still enough to make her blood run to ice. "He's really here," she whispered. "He actually followed me here." "He's not getting past this building," Min-jun said, turning to her, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly, forcing her focus away from the screen and onto him. "Stephanie, look at me. You are safe. I have 12 men in this building and access to more within the hour. He is not touching you tonight." "You don't know him," she said, panic climbing her throat like bile. "You don't know what he's capable of when he's cornered. He doesn't care about consequences. He never has. That's what made him so terrifying. Nothing scared him, nothing stopped him." "I scare him," Min-jun said quietly, and there was something in his voice now that Stephanie hadn't heard before. Not the gentle protector from the terminal, not the wounded son who'd confessed his mother's suffering, but something older, colder, forged in whatever fire had made Cha Min-jun into a name whispered with fear across an entire criminal underworld. "He allied himself with the Becks because he knows he cannot come at me alone. That is not the behavior of a man who isn't afraid. That is the behavior of a man calculating how much fear he can borrow before it runs out." Below, on the street, the small gray figure paused directly beneath a street lamp, tilting his face upward toward the building, toward, Stephanie realized with a fresh wave of horror, the exact floor they stood on, as though he somehow knew precisely which windows hid her. "He knows I'm here," she breathed. "He's guessing," Min-jun said, though his tightened jaw suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own reassurance. He turned to Sungmin. "Get eyes on every entrance. If he tries to come inside, I want to know before he clears the lobby." "You think it's one of ours," Sungmin said, not a question. "I think," Min-jun said grimly, "that Kelechi Obi did not simply stumble into the right city and the right building by instinct. Someone handed him a map. I want to know who drew it." He returned to the apartment 2 hours later to find Stephanie exactly where he'd left her, curled on the couch with her knees drawn to her chest, eyes red-rimmed but dry, the particular exhausted calm of someone who had cried until there was simply nothing left to cry with. She rose the moment he walked through the door, searching his face for injury, for danger, for any sign of what had happened in his absence. "You're okay," she breathed, relief cracking her voice. "I'm okay," he confirmed, and something in him softened seeing the genuine terror that had clearly gripped her while he was gone. Terror for him, not for herself, which struck him as strange and precious in a way he didn't have language for yet. "He didn't come for me tonight. He came to send a warning. And to do it, he had help from inside my own organization." Stephanie's face went pale. "Someone told him where you'd be." "Someone told him a great many things," Min-jun said, sinking into the chair across from her, suddenly and visibly tired in a way she hadn't yet seen from him. "Which means this is no longer only about protecting you from him. It's about finding whoever inside my walls decided your life, and possibly mine, was worth selling." "This is my fault," Stephanie whispered. "If I'd never run into that terminal, if I'd never grabbed you." "Stop," Min-jun said, sharper than he intended, and then softer, reaching for her hand across the space between them. "I told you already. None of this is a debt you owe for surviving. If anything," he continued, quieter now, "you gave me the excuse I'd been circling for 3 years, a reason to finally finish what Obi's people started in Busan. I should be thanking you, not the reverse." She studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Not just fear anymore, but a kind of dawning, cautious tenderness she hadn't let herself feel toward a man in 8 months. "You're a strange kind of dangerous," she said finally, a small, exhausted laugh escaping despite everything. Most men who scare an entire city don't sit up half the night worrying about whether a stranger has eaten. Most men who scare an entire city, Min-jun said, the corner of his mouth lifting into something almost like a real smile, have never had someone run into their arms and ask to be kissed to survive. It changes a man's priorities rather quickly. The moment stretched between them, warm and fragile, until Sung-min's voice crackled through the intercom, apologetic but urgent, shattering it entirely. "Boss, we have a name. The Leak." Min-jun's expression hardened instantly, the tenderness folding itself away behind the composed mask Stephanie was beginning to understand was as much armor as it was face. "Bring him up." 10 minutes later, 2 of Min-jun's men escorted a third, younger than the others, barely into his 30s, his composure cracking visibly the moment he stepped into the apartment and saw the expression waiting for him. Stephanie recognized him vaguely. He'd been in the room during that first frantic afternoon, one of the men working the monitors, quiet and unremarkable, exactly the kind of person no one thought to suspect. "Tae-young," Min-jun said, his voice deceptively calm, the calm Stephanie now recognized as the most dangerous register he possessed. "Tell me about the money." The younger man's face drained of color entirely. "Boss, I don't." "Don't," Min-jun said quietly, and the single word carried more menace than any shout could have. "I have account transfers dated 3 days before Obi arrived in Seoul. I have a payment that traces back to a shell company the Becks have used before. And I have you, standing in my home, unable to look me in the eye. Do not waste what little time you have left explaining to me that you don't know." Tae-young's legs seemed to give slightly, and one of the guards steadied him with a rough hand on his shoulder. "They threatened my sister," he said, voice cracking. "The Becks. They found her in Busan. They said if I didn't give them information about the woman you brought in, about your movements, they'd—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I didn't have a choice, boss. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Stephanie watched Min-jun's face carefully, bracing for the violence she half expected, the cold fury she'd glimpsed in flashes throughout the day. Instead, something more complicated crossed his features. Recognition, maybe, of a man cornered the way he himself had once described his mother being cornered, forced into an impossible choice by people who understood exactly how to weaponize love against loyalty. "Where is your sister now?" Min-jun asked, quieter than Stephanie expected. "I don't know," Tae-young whispered. "They stopped answering my calls yesterday." Min-jun was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that filled the entire room. "You should have come to me the moment they threatened her," he said. "I would have protected her. Instead, your silence may have cost me the one thing I have spent 3 years trying to protect, and it may have already cost your sister her life." He turned to Sung-min. "Find her. Tonight. Whatever it costs." Then to Tae-young, "You will not be harmed. But you will help me find every thread the Becks have wrapped around this city, starting now, or I promise you, the mercy I am showing tonight will not extend to tomorrow." As the men filed out, Stephanie remained frozen on the couch, watching the fragile machinery of loyalty, fear, and consequence turning around her, and understanding, with sudden, sickening clarity, that the war Kelechi had started reached far beyond herself, into the lives of strangers, siblings, entire families who had never asked to be caught in the crossfire of one man's obsession. "This is bigger than both of us now," she said quietly, once the room had emptied. "It always was," Min-jun said, sitting heavily beside her, exhaustion finally breaking through his composure completely. "Obi didn't just chase a woman across the world, Stephanie. He brought a war with him. The only question left is whether we finish it before it finishes something, someone neither of us can afford to lose." Outside, the Seoul skyline glittered on, indifferent and endless, while somewhere across the city, in a room lit only by the cold blue glow of a laptop, Kelechi Obi smiled at a photograph of a terrified young woman he had never met, Tae-young's sister, and made a phone call that would set the final bloodiest phase of his war into motion. The final message arrived just after 2 in the morning, delivered not through Sung-min's carefully monitored channels but directly to Stephanie's burner phone, a photograph of a young woman bound to a chair, terrified eyes staring into the camera, and beneath it, a single line of text from an unknown number. "Come to the old Incheon fish market alone by dawn, or 2 women die tonight instead of 1. Stephanie's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. "Min-jun," she whispered, and he was beside her in an instant, reading the message over her shoulder, his jaw tightening into something carved from stone. "That's Taeyong's sister," he said grimly. "He's escalated. He's no longer just chasing you. He's trying to force an ending on his terms, before we can find him first." "I have to go," Stephanie said, already reaching for her coat. "Absolutely not." Min-jun caught her wrist, gentle but immovable. "That is exactly what he wants. You walking into a location he controls, alone, is not bravery, Stephanie. It's exactly the ending he's been trying to write since Lagos." "So what, we just leave her to die?" Stephanie's voice cracked. "I know what it feels like to be the woman in that photograph. I am not doing that to someone else." Min-jun was silent for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. Calculation, fear, and beneath both, a fierce, protective resolve that had nothing to do with strategy. "Then we go," he said finally. "Together. My way, not his." By the time the sky over Incheon began bruising gray with the first threat of dawn, Min-jun's men had already surrounded the old fish market's perimeter, silent and invisible, while Stephanie walked the last 100 meters alone across the cracked concrete, exactly as instructed, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Kelechi stepped out from behind a rusted stall the moment she entered, flanked by 2 Beck lieutenants, his face splitting into the same charming smile that had once convinced her sister he was the answer to every prayer. "You came," he said softly. "I knew you would. You always did have a hero complex, Stephanie. Just usually it was reserved for me." "Let her go," Stephanie said, forcing steel into her voice despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "You wanted me. I'm here. Let the girl go." Kelechi's smile didn't waver. "See, that's the thing about you I always loved," he said, stepping closer, close enough that she could smell the cologne that used to mean safety and now only meant terror. "So noble. So willing to sacrifice yourself for other people. Never once willing to sacrifice yourself for me." "I gave you 8 months of my life," Stephanie said, and something in her voice surprised even herself, not fear, but a rising, furious clarity. "I gave you bruises I still carry. I gave you every version of myself I had until there was nothing left. I don't owe you anything, Kelechi. Not anymore." His face contorted, the mask finally slipping entirely, revealing the rage that had always lived beneath the charm. He lunged for her wrist, the same wrist he'd bruised in Lagos, the same gesture of ownership he'd repeated 100 times, and this time, before his fingers could close around her, a single gunshot cracked through the gray dawn air, and one of the Beck lieutenants crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted. Min-jun's men emerged from every shadow of the market at once, and Kelechi spun, dragging Stephanie in front of him as a shield, a knife appearing from somewhere in his jacket, pressed cold against her throat. "Back off!" he shouted, backing toward the exit, Stephanie's spine pressed rigid against his chest. "Back off, or I swear to God. Let her go, Obi." Min-jun's voice cut through the chaos, calm and absolute, as he stepped into view, hands empty, deliberately unarmed, walking forward with a steadiness that made even his own men hold their breath. "This ends now. One way or another. But it ends. You think I'm afraid of you?" Kelechi's voice cracked with something between fury and desperation, the blade trembling slightly against Stephanie's skin. "I have half of Seoul's underworld backing me now." "Look around you," Min-jun said quietly, and Kelechi did, finally registering that the 2 Beck lieutenants who remained had already lowered their weapons, hands raised, faces pale, because behind Min-jun's men stood a third contingent entirely, men Kelechi didn't recognize, wearing the unmistakable insignia of the Beck family itself. The Becks decided this morning that an alliance with a trafficker who kills his own suppliers over jealousy wasn't worth the war it would cost them. "You've been abandoned, Obi. It's just you now." Kelechi's grip on the knife faltered, just slightly, just enough, and Stephanie, drawing on 8 months of buried survival instinct, drove her elbow back into his ribs with every ounce of strength 8 months of fear had built inside her. He staggered, the blade slipping from her throat, and in that single unguarded second, she wrenched herself free and ran, not away from danger this time, but toward it, toward Min-jun, who caught her and pulled her behind him in one motion as his men closed the remaining distance around Kelechi entirely. It was over in less than a minute. Kelechi Obi, the man who had haunted 3 countries and 8 months of Stephanie's life, was on his knees on the cracked concrete of a fish market at dawn, surrounded, disarmed, and utterly, finally powerless, while somewhere behind the stalls, Taeyong's sister was found alive, shaken but unharmed, exactly where the Cha Min-jun's men had extracted hours earlier said she would be. Stephanie stood in the pale light of the rising sun, watching the man who had once made her believe love meant fear be led away in silence, and felt something inside her chest finally, quietly, unclench, a knot 8 months in the tying, released all at once. "It's over," Min-jun said softly beside her. "It's over," she repeated, testing the words like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. Weeks later, with Kelechi's trafficking network dismantled and exposed to authorities across 3 countries, and the fragile peace between Min-jun's organization and the Beck family holding, Stephanie stood once more at the edge of the Han River, no longer running, no longer looking over her shoulder, beside a man whose real name she now knew completely, who had promised her, in a crowded terminal on the worst night of her life, a kiss that was never meant to be the last one after all, but the first of many that came after, freely given, and never again out of fear.